Every week, every day, there are discoveries that will shape our future. The Research Beat, brought to you by Audemic, speaks to the unsung heroes of groundbreaking research and those laying the foundations for the advances of tomorrow. Why? Because we believe the more we discover, the more we connect the dots, the more we push our understanding of the world forward. This week on The Research Beat, we speak to Maria O'Hanlon, a PhD researcher in mitochondria and Parkinson's disease with the National Horizon Centre at Teesside University. Welcome to the Audemic podcast.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to be speaking with you today.
Maria, could you start by giving us an overview of your research?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm studying, as you said, the role of mitochondria in Parkinson's disease. So I'm actually doing that in Drosophila or fruit fly model. And what I'm specifically looking at is a potential rescue mutation. Basically, I'm trying to explore whether this mutation will alleviate the symptoms of Parkinson's disease and can therefore be used in treatment. So when an individual gets Parkinson's, the part of the brain that makes dopamine dies, and dopamine, if you don't know, is a neurotransmitter, and it sends all of the information to the cells in your body to tell them basically what to do. So it gives them instructions on performing actions. And in Parkinson's, this part of the patient's brain dies, and therefore the body doesn't function properly. But they don't know currently what causes Parkinson's disease. They don't know what causes that neuronal loss. And one of the hypotheses is that it's mitochondria. So if you're not familiar, mitochondria are the energy producing cells of the body. And basically they've discovered that there's some poisons that affect mitochondria and it causes Parkinson's-like symptoms. Like I said, I work with fruit flies, but basically one of the main reasons why I use them is because flies share many of the genes that are associated with Parkinson's in humans. And although the symptoms are not exactly the same, they are very, very similar. So you'll see that the fly has trouble climbing, trouble functioning normally. So most of my day is spent looking down a microscope, and I perform something called behavioural assays, where I basically look at how well the disease flies are climbing compared to normal wild type flies that you would just find in the wild. And climbing is controlled by dopamine. So if you have Parkinson's disease, you don't have dopamine, and therefore Parkinson's disease flies aren't going to be able to climb. So from there, I'm introducing specific mutations into the genome, so mitochondrial mutations, and I'm looking to see if that improves the fly's climbing and therefore the Parkinson's disease. And hopefully we're onto something here. We have found something that we think is a rescue mutation, so hopefully that'll be something that we can focus some more investigations on. And I guess the aim of it all is that we could use that particular gene as a target for Parkinson's disease therapy. So essentially, I'm searching for a cure, but, it doesn't always work out that way.
Thank you for that. It's fascinating and a complicated and delicate process. So when you mentioned that you use fruit flies as a vector, could you explain for our audience exactly what that entails and the actual physical process of using these flies as a model for your research?
Yeah, definitely. So fruit flies are very easy to manipulate, and they only have 4 chromosomes as opposed to humans. But because they only have 4 chromosomes, it means that we can really easily affect their genes. We can really easily introduce different things into the genome. And because flies have something that we call balancer chromosomes, so it's where we can actually have a look at phenotypes of flies. So I can introduce a particular phenotype and tag it, if you will, to the Parkinson's disease gene. Okay. And it means when I look down a microscope, the flies appear different. So in my instance, the flies that have Parkinson's disease have white eyes, and then my mitochondrial flies have curly wings. So it means that I can do something called a genetic cross. And that's something that I suppose you hear about it a little bit with like mice. If you mate 2 different mice that have 2 different sets of genes, just like you do with a human, if you have a parent that has brown eyes and another parent who has blue eyes, their offspring might have brown eyes or blue eyes or green eyes. But because we really understand the fly's genetics, we can predict what the offspring are going to be. So I can really easily mate a normal fly with a Parkinson's fly, or a Parkinson's fly with a mitochondrial fly, and I can predict what progeny I'm going to get. And I also know what I'm looking for. So I said there that sometimes they have white eyes, sometimes they have curly wings. And because I can tag the flies with specific phenotypes like that, so phenotypes is basically what you see with the naked eye, it means that when I then look down the microscope, I can really easily identify the gene and the flies that have the genes that I'm interested in. So it sounds quite complex, but when you work with them all the time, you do really get used to how the flies look. You get used to, what wild normal flies look like compared to a diseased fly. And the more that you work with them, the more you can just see these things really, really easily. And it's quite an easy way of introducing genes into a model, without micro injecting and things like that. It's quite straightforward.
So you literally have a lab full of flies.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I have 2 incubators that are full to the brim with lots of flies. I keep them in plastic tubes that have little stoppers on the top because obviously flies fly away, and so I have to prevent them from doing that. But I have maybe at the minute I have about 80 different genotypes of flies. So those are all flies that have different types of DNA. And I have maybe about 15 trays of flies, and on one tray of flies I can have around about 8 million different flies. So
Wow.
I am the mother of millions, if you want to call it that.
So I have to ask, do the flies ever escape? Because I've seen a very funny video on one of your social media channels of you clapping the flies in the air.
Yeah, they do. So, fly work, you have to be quite quick. And when I do something called transfers, where I basically change their food every week, and I have to move all the flies from one plastic vial into another, and I have to do that quite quickly. And sometimes I don't do it quite quickly enough, even though I've been working with them for 3 years. Sometimes I'm not quite fast enough. And yes, the odd one does get away. But because they're genetically modified organisms, I do have to kill them, unfortunately. So if one does escape, I have to try and squish it quite quickly. I also have a bug zapper in the lab, so UV light that they're really attracted to. So if any do get into the lab atmosphere, then the hope is that they would migrate towards that light and they would get zapped, which I realise sounds very, very dark, but it's just what we have to do to make sure everything's kept safe, because we obviously don't want them getting into the wild and mating with flies that are endogenous to this area. So, but yes, they do escape a lot.
I'd love to pick up on that point. So has it ever endangered your research in any way? The nature of the flies, sometimes they will try to escape. Has that ever affected your research adversely?
Yeah, so sometimes if I'm setting up a climbing assay, so when I'm wanting to have a look at how the flies climb, I have to transfer them into climbing apparatus. And if I maybe knock that over, they might escape. And then that means that that experiment is ruined for that particular day or that particular week. And with the nature of flies, you have to wait until they start birthing. And especially when you're waiting for a specific genotype, if they're quite sick and they're quite precious, if then you lose them purely, by human error, by dropping them or whatever, then it can be a bit of a kick in the gut. And sometimes as well, a lot of my work relies on the flies mating, and sometimes they just don't mate, or they don't mate as much as I want them to, which means that I don't get a lot of progeny, and then I can't do the experiment that I'd set up for that week. So that's something that I have to be quite aware of, and it's something that I didn't probably take into account when I first started. I think you think that everything's going to be very plain sailing, and then something as simple as that, like knocking them over or there just not being enough flies, can really halt your research for a little bit. And it can just depend as well, if there's a change in temperature, that can really affect them and they can die. So over Christmas it was quite cold and I lost a lot of flies because it was just too cold and they didn't survive. So coming back after Christmas, it was quite hard to get the lab going again and nurture and baby the flies, so that I started having more of them again to look after them. So yeah, there's a lot of things that I have to consider, and it can unfortunately affect my research, but you've just got to try and crack on and carry on.
Absolutely. And it really shows up the delicate and transient nature of the research. As you say, some of these flies are precious. because of the particular stage of life they're at or the conditions inside their body. Sometimes you can also be subject to environmental pressures. So it's a very precise procedure. I would love to ask you about the role of the National Horizon Centre. And I would like to know how specifically this centre has helped you in your research. Could you just give us some more information about the centre generally and its role?
Yeah, so I work at the National Horizon Centre, which is a centre of excellence for the biosciences in the northeast of England. It's part of Teesside University, but it is a building that is purely dedicated to the biosciences. And we have all sorts of research going on here. We have people who do health and disease related research, we have people who look at biotechnology, and we have people who look at ecology and the environment, we have bioinformatics. We have scientists from all walks of life and from all different disciplines, which is amazing in terms of my research because it's not all just about me. You know, I do experiments that sometimes I need some help on that I maybe am not super familiar with. So, yes, I work with the flies and I know the flies really well, but that's not all of my research. I do some molecular studies as well, where I look at the flies' DNA and their RNA and have a look at when Parkinson's is present in their genes. Does that affect how much DNA is being produced? Does that affect, you know, what proteins are being produced within the fly's body? And that's not something that I know loads about. So working in a place like the NHC where you have experts in those sort of fields, it's a really nice place to work because I can very easily just go up to somebody and say, oh, you know, I'm struggling with this particular experiment. Could you give me some advice? And I don't think you necessarily get that in too many institutions because, you know, I work really closely with everybody here and I know everybody really well. And if you're in a slightly bigger institution or if you're in maybe different medical centres, then you might not cross paths as much. So I count myself really lucky to be able to work, you know, side by side, shoulder to shoulder with people who don't necessarily do the same research as me because I feel like I learn more that way.
That sounds wonderful, and it must be especially helpful for you as a scientist to work in this hive of connectivity in a working lab where you can always bump in to people who are doing different research and to have that network of support, like you say.
Definitely. The support's a massive part of it, yeah.
And that support, it must be especially helpful during the study of a PhD.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think when you're doing a PhD, you can often feel quite lonely because a lot of the work that you do is solo and you know you've only got a finite amount of time to complete it, and sometimes I think you just need to have a bit of a moan to somebody who understands what it's like because you know we can go home and we can talk to our families and our partners and our friends about it, but unless you're doing a PhD as well, a lot of it is lost in translation because it isn't really like a normal job and you do have a lot of pressures that you don't necessarily get from, I say normal with, you know, a bit of sarcasm, but you know, it's really nice to be surrounded by other people who are doing PhDs or have done PhDs because you can go to them and they share a lot of the problems that you share. You're all going through the same process and you're all experiencing a very similar journey. So it's really nice to be able to just walk up to somebody and say, oh, you know, I'm having a bit of a stress, I'm having a bit of a rubbish day, this is why, and they understand it and it just really makes you feel better and it makes you feel less alone.
Absolutely. I would love to pick up a little bit later on those personal pressures you've mentioned because you're very candid about those when you're communicating science to a broader audience. Just briefly to focus on your research, I wanted to ask you, what's the intended outcome of your research? What ideally would you like to reach? And how would you like to translate that into the real world, into a genuine scientific development?
Yeah, so I mean, like I touched on at the start, the goal is to understand more about the mechanisms behind Parkinson's disease. You know, there's not that much currently known about the cause of it, and even you know, the research that I'm doing will play such a small part in that because it is a much wider picture than what I'm maybe communicating today. But I will play a very, very small part of that. But nevertheless, it is a part of that and it's advancing us further forward to understanding how we can potentially cure or treat this disease better. I guess the hope for me is that, and I'm already in the works of this, is producing papers to the wider scientific community about the advances that we found. So I touched on the fact that we found a particular mutation that we think improves Parkinson's. So, I'm only going to be doing this research for 3 years. I'm sort of nearing the end of my PhD now. So if I don't continue in this area, then the hope is that somebody else would pick up where I left off and keep looking at this particular gene. And hopefully it can be something that in the future can be used as a target for Parkinson's disease therapies. And because that is severely lacking at the minute. And, although it is just one kind of subtype of Parkinson's disease, like I said, there's inherited and there's sporadic. So it's not going to be a blanket cure for everybody, but it is going to hopefully be something that can be targeted for a small proportion of that population. And, I think if we could just play a tiny part in that, even if it doesn't work out, even if further down the line we get to look at it and actually maybe it's not something that we can target and it doesn't maybe improve Parkinson's like we think it does, that's fine, because then it can be a cross on that particular gene and we're like, right, fair enough, we now know that that doesn't work, but then we can move on to the next thing. And that's what it's all about, not just for me and my research group and my supervisor, but kind of improving the knowledge in the Parkinson's community. And hopefully, if enough people work in this area, then we will be able to find a cure. And I do wholeheartedly believe that if enough, research is poured into it, then we can find something that is either a cure or, if not, a really strong therapeutic that is going to, massively improve the lives of patients with Parkinson's disease. Of course, that's quite far away. Obviously, I'm working with a fly model right now, so there's a lot of hoops that you'd have to jump to before you get to human studies and clinical trials. But, we've started the process, and that's the main thing.
It sounds like a very genuine pursuit. As you say, you are working hard to produce some knowledge that you can give to a wider community, that you can share with a broader group of scientists, in the hope that eventually everything can come together to form a cure. Would you like to continue this research after your PhD? Do you have any plans in your mind to develop this further and to keep going with it?
Yeah, I think it would be amazing to continue with this, because I think, with having started it, it's nice to always see it to its natural end. But I think if I was to continue in research, then I would actually like to maybe broaden my horizons a little bit and focus more on the role of mitochondria in health and disease, because that's what my main interest is. That's where I was passionate about before I even applied for this project. So I think if I was able to do that, that would be amazing, because mitochondria are involved in so many different diseases, and the health of mitochondria is so important for people's lives. And I don't think that that's necessarily appreciated too much. It's not something that many people are aware of, and it is involved in so many diseases. It's involved in Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, even cancer. It's had ties to inflammatory bowel disease, various different diseases. So I think a lot of research needs to be poured into that area. So it would be nice to stay and keep on looking at Parkinson's disease, but I wouldn't be opposed to going in a slightly broader direction and maybe having a look at a different disease that's involved in mitochondria, or even looking at it a bit broader.
1, 2, 3, 4.
The Research Beat is brought to you by the Audemic app, a platform for students and researchers which allows you to listen to academic articles and take notes easily. On the go and simple to share. So would it be fair to say that your particular passion is mitochondria?
Yes, yeah, definitely. That's definitely the area that I wanted to go into when I first started looking at the area of biology, if you will, that I wanted to go into. So yeah, I'd definitely like to continue on that route.
Is there a special story behind that? I would love to know how you first became interested in this world and in mitochondria specifically.
Yeah, so there is. When I was looking at doing biology at school, I got involved with a children's occupational therapy group. So my mum works for this particular therapy group, and they work with children who have disabilities, who maybe have certain illnesses or diseases. And through her, I became aware of a child called Leighton who had mitochondrial disease. And to be honest, at that point, I hadn't really heard of mitochondrial disease. It was sort of a bit of a mystery to me. And in speaking to him more and his family more and learning more about the disease, I realised just how much of an impact the destruction or the damage of such a small, small part of our bodies. I mean, the mitochondria are in all of the cells of our body, but they're so small, and it just blew my mind that damage to such a small organelle can cause such massive destruction in the body. And Leighton was a very, very poorly young boy. I mean, he was only maybe about 9 when I first became acquainted, and he was very, very poorly. He had a lot of issues in terms of like his heart and his brain, and is essentially his body was shutting down, and there is no cure to the type of mitochondrial disease that he has. And it really inspired me, and I really want to learn more about mitochondria, mitochondrial disease itself, but just the role of mitochondria within that, and learn more about how that can affect different diseases and how that can affect the progression of diseases. And I think in meeting him, and then unfortunately he passed away last year, it massively hit a nerve. And I thought, if I can do one thing with my life, it would be to improve the lives of patients like Leighton. And, mitochondrial disease is a disease that affects a lot of children. And I think, to play even a small role in improving the lives of children who may otherwise die, I can't think of anything else that would be more worthwhile to do with my life. So when I was looking at master's projects, I ended up doing a project looking at mitochondrial replication. And then when I was looking at PhD projects, I knew that I wanted to do something in mitochondria. So although it's not directly related, because obviously I'm looking at Parkinson's disease, it's still looking at mitochondria and developing understanding of how mitochondria are involved in disease. And that's why I would like to carry on down this path, and how, when I have really dark days or days where I really struggle, all I have to think about is Leighton, and it reminds me why I do it. And, it sounds really like cliche, but I really do feel like I owe a lot to him, because he's massively inspired my career. And when I write my thesis, I'll definitely, in my acknowledgements, be thanking him, because I feel like it sounds a bit strange, but it's almost as if I feel like his legacy carries on a little bit with the research that I do. And I just really hope that I can do something to help in that area. But yeah, that's the story.
It's a very touching story, and I think it's important because it reminds us that behind every researcher, there is a reason. There is a reason for the research, and I think sometimes people can forget about that. They imagine researchers as people behind closed doors doing mysterious things, and it's a process that just happens, but there really is a story behind everybody's intentions. And in this case, this is driving you every day, like you say, and it animates you and gives you the passion to keep pushing with your research. So I would love to pick up then on your communication with the wider community, your science communicating. And I think here too is a place where you're injecting a lot of passion into what you do. So could you tell us about your science communicating? How did it start?
Yeah, so I was doing my undergraduate degree, and I just didn't really have much confidence in myself. I'd just done pretty badly in my A levels, and I'd just managed to scrape a place at university, and I just felt a bit low, like I didn't have a place, and I was struggling to connect to other like-minded people. And I decided to set up a blog to practice my writing skills, and I thought it would be a nice way in private to just improve my own confidence in what I knew about science, because I just really didn't believe that I was any good. So I set up my blog and I just wrote about any area in science that I found interesting, whether that was a scientific story in the news or whether that was something that I was researching specifically for a piece of coursework. And when I was researching things to write about, I realised that there was a massive, massive gap in between communicating research to other scientists, but then also communicating that research to the wider public. And I felt like there was a lot of areas that, and it sounds really silly, but people like my mum and dad would really like to know about, but if they looked it up online, it would just be a load of scientific jargon, which meant absolutely nothing to them. So I thought, I'll start from here and I'll just do a few blog posts of things that I find interesting and really try to just strip it back and make it really, really simple, really easy to understand. And I did that for a couple of years. And then it was when I started my PhD, I felt again a little bit alone. And again, I guess support lacking a little bit of confidence. And I just really wanted to connect with other PhD students and other scientists. And I thought, you know what? I follow a lot of scientists on my Instagram through my private personal Instagram. And they were talking about the research that they did and they were connecting with other scientists. And I just thought, I want to be in on this. This sounds amazing. So I created an Instagram. And to be honest, I didn't really think it was going to go anywhere. But I found that the more I posted, the more people were interacting with what I had to say. And they were asking me questions about my research. And it was making me feel a lot more confident in explaining things. So I just continued with that and it took off, which was amazing. And I started doing stories on my Instagram where I was basically just talking to the camera about my day and about various different experiments I was doing. And that was getting a really popular response. So I decided that I would set up a podcast, basically because people were asking me to. And I thought that would be another nice place to talk about research, but I wanted to again strip everything back and just make it all a lot more accessible to the public, because I think when people think about scientists, they think, like you said before, people behind closed doors who are doing kind of wild, mysterious things that nobody ever really hears about. And I thought, you know, this is a really good opportunity to invite other scientists to have a bit of a chat with me, talk about their research in a really basic way, but then also talk about some of the things that make us normal people, which is the mistakes that we do in the lab. And, you know, like I said, talk about the trials and the tribulations, talk about the times that you've failed, talk about the times that you've smashed a beaker or you've lost something, lost a sample somewhere, or, you know, you've broken whatever.
It's wonderful actually, and the Instagram videos you mentioned, they're very funny, they're very informative. And it must be a joy for you when you get those questions and those comments and people expressing a true curiosity in your research and what you're doing.
It is, yeah. I think I always try and be the person that I would have liked to have had when I was just starting out in science. And I think I love nothing more than when I get a message from somebody who's maybe doing their A levels or is starting college or even is in the first year of their degree, and they ask me questions about how I got to where I am, or, you know, they might share something and they're like, oh, you know, I failed this exam, I feel like I'll never become what you are. And it's a really nice opportunity to be like, whoa, actually, you know, I failed exams before, I've like scraped through things, I have made mistakes, and, you know, there's no reason why that should hold you back. And it's really nice to play a part in boosting their confidence and showing them that, you know, they can do it if they set their mind to. There's no reason why they couldn't. And yeah, I love it. I love it when people send me questions. It's really nice. It makes me feel good.
I can imagine. And there's such a sharing of feeling between you and your audience, those asking you questions and giving comments. And I want to ask you if you think it's really important for researchers, for scientists to speak to the public in this way, because it's a relatively recent development. And previously, there were limited means of doing this. Perhaps a researcher, a scientist would appear on television, make a program and share something with the viewers that way. But today, thanks to social media, thanks to different technologies, you can really speak quite intimately with your audience. Do you think that's something really important that scientists could or should be doing more generally?
I definitely wholeheartedly believe that it's something that everybody should be doing. I recognize that it's maybe something that doesn't come naturally to people. You know, if you're maybe a bit shy or you're not really sure exactly how to talk about your research in a simple way. But I think it's important that there's people in place at institutions or people that you can contact to maybe help you with that and help you break down that science and help you communicate that better. But I think in a world where a lot of scientific research is funded by grants, which sometimes come from a research council, so that might be funded by the government, but sometimes it's from a charity and, you know, they rely on people giving them money to then put towards scientific research. So I think if you want to basically get money from people, then you have to be able to communicate what you're doing with that money and really show what's going on behind closed doors, because it's all very well and good saying, oh, well, you know, I'm going to research Parkinson's disease. But if people don't know exactly what you're doing, they're far less likely to be invested in you and want to, you know, donate or support you in your research. So I think it's really important to communicate that for, you know, that reason, but as well just to sort of show other scientists that this is an area that you can work in. Even students, you know, children, I love doing outreach with schools and, you know, especially schools in the local area, because I grew up here, I work here, and it's really nice to give back a little bit and say, well, you know, this is what I do as a career. Is this something that you would consider? And if you're not willing to talk about your research, then you can't really do that. And, you know, we always need to inspire, you know, the future scientists, and we need to be able to talk to them, and, you know, communicating your research is a really important part of that.
It's a very, very good point. And like you say, there's a bravery in opening up your little corner of research, the thing that you're really good at and that you understand totally, in opening that up to a wider audience and saying, here you are, this is what it is. Sometimes mistakes take place, sometimes things don't go exactly as planned, and is very important in creating a link, fostering understanding between researchers and everybody else. Would you like to develop your science communicating into the future alongside your research?
Definitely. Yeah, I think it was something that I started out just doing as a little bit of a hobby, and it is still a hobby. You know, I love doing it. I don't feel like it's work at all, but I would like to continue that as, if not my full career, as a massive part of my career, because I think it is really important that we do it. And, you know, I enjoy it. And, you know, if it gets the word out there about the research that I'm doing or that my group's doing, then yeah, I hope that I can keep doing it. That's definitely the aim. Whether or not I'll be able to or not is another question, but I will definitely try, because I just love it. It's a massive part of my research now, and to be honest, part of my like daily routine. I just kind of, it's so integrated in what I do now that I just automatically do it. And so I hope that I can continue doing that, because I do just get so much joy out of it.
With that in mind, I'm going to ask you my final question, which is, if you had unlimited funding, with both your research and your communicating in mind, how would you use that funding?
Oh, such a difficult question. I think probably it would come as no surprise that the scientific area that I'd want to research is mitochondria, probably specifically mitochondrial disease, because I think, you know, if I had unlimited funds, just think about all of the good that I could do with that and how much I'd be able to advance that area, you know, look at therapeutics, potentially even cures. There's a lot of advances have been made in the last decade. So they've looked at like the three parent baby to try and eliminate faulty mitochondria being introduced into the baby. But there's still a lot of area to be covered. So I think if I had unlimited scientific funds, that's definitely what I'd look into. In terms of communication, and I feel daft even saying this, but I would love to do a documentary. I think it would be amazing to, you know, produce something like that where you can really disseminate your research to the public. I feel like that makes me sound like I think I'm the next David Attenborough. I don't think that, but, you know, that would be an amazing thing to do. So if I did have the funds, then I would love to do something like that. But of course, continue with doing things like my Instagram and my podcast. Maybe even write a book. That would be pretty cool. But I think, you know, documentary would be up there. That would be amazing.
Well, I think your passion, your understanding of your subject, and your ability to share it with others to make it comprehensible is something that will help you continue to strengthen these things into the future. Maria, before we go, how can our listeners reach you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at a bio blog, or I think if you probably Google Maria O'Hanlon, all of my links come up. And my blog is abioblog.wordpress.com. So I talk about all different types of research on there. And I have my podcast as well, which is called Fly in the Lab. That's available on most podcast streaming services, and that's where I dispel the myths about science by sharing funny lab confessions with various other scientists, other lecturers. I'm trying to talk to as many people as I can on that. So yeah, I'm on TikTok, like I just said, but most of that is on my Instagram, and I'm also on Twitter, which is also at a bioblog. I'm pretty much everywhere online. So if you Google my name, you'll definitely be able to find all of my different links, but they're probably the main ones.
Okay, fantastic. There are plenty of ways to reach you. So, Maria, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today. For more on Maria, including her podcast, you can find her on social media or search for A Bioblog. And to listen to her academic research in full, sign up to the Audemic waiting list at audemic.com or follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn.